What's this about? Can you build a temple from a text? I think in one or two of the versions I put, can you design a building from a text? And maybe that, I think, can you build sounds better. And of course, they're two different things. To build something, you have to first design it and you have to draw it. And in the etymological sense, design, disegno, dessin is a drawing. So a drawing is a stage between the idea and the actual building. So if you want the short answer, can you build a temple from a text? Yes, you can, but you first have to draw it. And can you draw and design a building from a text? Yes, you can, but you have to know the architectural language, the architectural system, the tradition, and you have to be able to interpret the text. But the connection is not a random one, and I hope to show you by going through worked examples, using a text and arriving at a design, that the designs really are in the text, and that the text is not some abstruse theoretical thing divorced from practice, nor is it something that you can be strictly followed and can tell you everything about a design. And to understand that relationship, you really have to go through the process. So learn the architectural language, and I will tell you a few essentials so that when I go through the texts, I hope you will see that I'm not just making up the design. So that's the short answer. Yeah, that's the short answer. So those who are now happy with the answer can please switch off. And those who would like me to explain it further, please stay. The lecture will be in two parts, looking first at South Indian Dravida architecture and Nagara architecture from North India in the second part. The texts that I'm referring to in the first part are the Manasara, the Mayamata, and the Deept Agama. Manasara and Mayamata, of course, are well-known Shastras or Vastushastras, and the Deept Agama is an Agama, a ritual text, which, like many of these, contains considerable portions about architecture. All of these texts have been published, and Manasara and Mayamata translated into English, but I have found that one needs to work with a Sanskritist, unless one's Sanskrit is good enough, which mine isn't. So I've been working with Sanskritists on new translations of these texts. And working together, you find that the text, the translation, can be done literally, but then you have to refine it and modify it in relation to the designs that are contained in the text. So you can, it's a two-way process. It's not just somebody does the translation and then you understand the architecture. You've got to understand something about the architecture in order to fully understand the text. Now, drawings from shastras, vastushastras, shilpashastras, have not been done enough. Strangely enough, or interestingly enough, the very first modern scholarship on temple architecture in India, Ram Razi's Temple Architecture of the Hindus, published in 1834, contains some very good drawings done from portions of the Manasara that Ram Raz and his practitioner collaborators were able to get hold of and understand in their own style, but they really did understand the relationship between the text and the practice. 100 years later, when P.K. Acharya did his monumental series of works on Manasara, he didn't realize that the Manasara was a South Indian text of maybe something like 10th or 11th century, but took it as the kind of ore text, the Vitruvius of Indian architecture. And his collaborator, who was an engineer, did these wonderful sort of Art Deco buildings, which anyone can see now don't look like South Indian temples. So, like I say, you have to know the language, the architectural language. So a lot of you do now from this course know a lot about South Indian temples, but here, I want to tell you some basics which we need to bear in mind when looking at the text. So very early wooden prototypes existed. We can tell from relief carvings and paintings at Ajanta and so on that wooden buildings existed which were the prototypes of Dravida architecture. Two basic sorts, one with a kuta on top, a square or circular domed pavilion, and another type often seen in gateways, which has a rectangular shala on the top. And these prototypes were translated into stone or into brick, monumentalized, not copying the wooden forms, but translating them into a language of monumental masonry. So the most basic Dravida temples, as you probably know, are called Ekatala, one-story temples. And in Tamil Nadu, in the far south of India, the principal way of varying these is simply to vary the shape of the plan: square, rectangular, apsidal, circular, octagonal, or alternatively varying simply the top, the kuta or the shala, or basically the roof form. So you can have a circular kuta roof on a square base, and so on. Then there are vertical divisions that we need to know about when looking at the text. This kind of alpa vimana, simple vimana, ektala, one-story vimana, is conceived of as having 6 divisions, 6 angas or vargas. It's sat anga or sat varga. A molded base or adhisthana, a wall called stamba or pada, and the terms vary. Then a prastara, which is sometimes translated as entablature, which is over the wall. Then a kanta or gala or griva, a neck, which often is understood to contain the Vedika molding, the Vedi molding, which represents a railing. Then the shikara, which is the roof, and then the stupika, which is the finial. So bear in mind those 6 divisions. And you can have simple vimanas still considered or classified as ekatala, one story, which have conceptually three stories. You can see already the one on the left has a kuta on top of a wall, which is kind of like 2 stories. This is kind of like 3 stories, but it is still considered a one-story vimana. It'll maybe become clear as we go along, but that basically is one of the ones on the left, which has become the superstructure of something with 1 extra prastara and 1 extra stamba. Now, as things develop, the temple becomes multi-story and it becomes multi-edicular. The one temple develops from being a single unit, a single house for the god, to being a multi-storied palace of the gods made up of many little temples. many small houses for the different manifestations or aspects or subordinates or of the main deity. There may or may not be pilasters in the wall, but when there are, it's particularly explicit that the elements, the building blocks of this divine palace, are themselves images of that basic Ekatala Vimana or Alpa Vimana. We have a fat one of those on the top and a slender one of those on the corners, and Shala-topped edicules in the middle. But there's yet another way, dimension we need to look at, and that is the moldings. The base, Adhisthana, is itself made up of several moldings, and we shall see presently that you get alternative choices for different types of Adhisthana. Then we have the wall itself with the pilasters made of stone or brick, but representing those timber posts that go back to the wooden prototypes, with brackets and a beam at the top, and then a kapota, which is a thatched eave originally, then a prati, sometimes a vyalamala when it's got vyalas in, and makaras and other creatures all over it. But however many creatures, it represents a wooden floor with the ends of timber joists. And then, optionally, but usually, a vedika, which is a railing to stop people upstairs falling out, then a griva or a neck, the inhabitable part of the upper pavilion, and then the shikara or the roof with its finials or stupikas on top. In the case of a shala, three or more, several stupikas lined up. So the shala is the pavilion on the top of this unit. And we have the shala, the kuta, and a third basic element, which is the panjara, which is like a shala taken through 90 degrees, and you see the horseshoe gable on the end. We can argue about whether it's conceived as a rectangular one embedded or as an apsidal one embedded. You can't see what's behind anyway, but it's, of course, in the imagination, there is a three-dimensional form embedded within the body of the temple. So that seems pretty clear. And those are the units making two stories, but one tala, two imaginary stories in that there is a pavilion on the top, but one tala or bhumi of the vimana or prasada of the temple. But just to complicate things, there's this other way of looking, which we've already touched on, where you have the different angas or vargas, in which case the adhisthana is one, the stambha, or pada, is the wall, and the prastara is the beam at the top of the wall, the bhutamala or hamsamala or whatever kind of garland of creatures you have underneath the overhanging eaves of the kapota. The kapota itself, the thatched eaves with its gable windows, little faces looking out, and the prati or vyalamala, which is the floor. So that you need to understand that definition of prastara to understand which bit the texts are talking about when they give you the size of the prastara. And when they talk about one tala or bhumi, one story, they usually give you the height of the wall and the height of the prastara, and they leave it to the architect, or you need to know, the architect needs to know that there's the rest of the kuta or the shala needs to go on top of that. And of course, you can have three-story elements like this, like the Ashtavarga Alpavimana, which can become the main elements in the wall. So the thing on the left becomes the superstructure of a more complex element. And once you understand this, it's very easy in looking at a temple elevation to describe the composition reasonably succinctly. This has got a round kuta-topped Alpavimana on the top, and then the second tala is made up of kuta, shala, shala, kuta. The first tala, adi tala, has kuta, panjara, shala, panjara, kuta. And these wonderful photogrammetric models that I am showing have been made by my friend and colleague Kailash Rao in various projects that we have done together. They give you a true elevation without having to climb up and measure every little bit, which is very useful if you're trying to compare, for example, proportions given in a text and proportions in actual practice. Now, we're moving on now to texts. Now you understand the language. These are from the Maya Mata, and like the other texts, we are given a whole variety of different adhisthanas to choose from. And all along you'll find, especially in these southern texts, you're given the architect is given a choice. You can have this or that or that. Within the framework, you're given these choices. And one of the choices is what kind of adhisthana are we going to have? Now, be careful when you read something like the Encyclopedia of Indian Temple Architecture, where they label a page, or they label a photo of an adhisthana, and it says this is a Sri Bandha, or this is a Shreni Bandha or Padma Bandha, because they don't tell you which text they got these terms from. And with terminology, it's so fluid, and different texts use different terms for the same type. And moreover, different texts, and even within the same text, you can find different words for the same thing. So if you look at the rounded molding there, which is a kumuda, can be three-faceted, but the examples in my little sketches are all round. You can see the different names: kumuda, kairawa, abja, vrita, kumuda, ashtash, ravrapa, and vrita kumbha. So although there's about 5 different names for the same element. And you might say, well, it's just because Adam didn't know the meaning of those words, so he just drew a round thing. But I hope to convince you that it's not that, because once you twig what the text is talking about, you follow you follow its logic, and you will find that you have to know more. It's not a matter of knowing the word and applying the word. It's a matter of knowing the architecture and knowing what the word means from the context. May not be convinced, but anyway, these also, you'll notice that they don't have the neat divisions that I showed you earlier between different courses, where each course is a different molding. That remains the fact, but the text labels every single little sub-molding. So in your mind, you have to make sense. You have to get the idea of what they mean and draw it accordingly. But I think when we look at the overall design, this will become clearer. Now, one difference between northern and southern texts is the way they describe the designs of different temple types. In the northern ones, which we'll look at in the second half of the lecture, as you see on the left, they always start with a plan. They start with a square, and they say divide it into a number of parts. And that is the talamana, the measurement of the plan. And then having given you the plan, they move on to the elevation, the urdhva mana, the upper measurement, and you go from the bottom up. If you expect that in the South Indian texts, you don't find that. You'll find they usually go straight into telling you about the widths of the wall, and then they go into the height. They don't give you a square plan and start from there. You have to look at the passages where they give you a lot of options for the width of the size of the sanctum, the height of the proportional height of the temple in relation to the width. So there, from the Mayamata, you could the proportion of width to height could be 1/3, 1 to 3, 3 to 5, 4 to 7, 5 to 9, 6 to 11, 7 to 13, 8 to 15, 9 to 17, 1 to 2, or the rest has gone behind the pictures on the left. I can't read, but so you get a lot of choices. And moreover, in a different place in the same text, they say there are 4 different heights: Paushtika, Sashantika, and so on, 2 to 3, 7 to 10, 4 to 7, and 1 to 2. And other texts will give you different options. So basically it's saying there's a lot of freedom within the recipe to modulate it with different heights. So you have to find out for a given design which height is going to look good and which one is going to look silly. So now we come to an actual worked example. It's a temple type called the svastika from the Deept Agama. So we'll go through it and I will draw it as we go along. So it starts, these translations are done by Libby Mills. We work together on this. So there's this type starts with the measurement of the breadth, and it says the breadth is 5 hastas. Now, hastas is an absolute measurement. I think it's a cubit. It's sort of about 2 feet, but usually that's a separate issue, the actual size. What we're mainly concerned with is the proportional size between the relative size between the different parts. So forget the 5 hastas. It's a small temple about 10 feet square. Forget that. It says divide it into 6 parts. The breadth of the kuta is 1 part. The length of the shala is 2. The hara is 1 part, and adorned with a hara panjara. Now, so we've got these 6 parts, and hara in modern scholarship is what they often call the harantara, the bit in between. But in what I found that usually the more usual term is hara, which in modern scholarship means the whole chain of elements. But hara here, clearly from the context, it means the recess, the bit in between. And the hara panjara, well, let's draw the kutas and shalas, because we know they're going to be up at the top of the first tala. Incidentally, we also know this is going to be a dvitala, a two tala vimana, because we've already been told that. So we know that it mentions kuta shala. We know it's going to be on the top of the wall. So let's draw those first. And it's very interesting that these widths are conceived in terms of the kutas and shalas at the top, which kind of confirms that they're thinking of the whole wall with its crowning elements, whether or not there are pilasters in the wall. The wall is proportioned according to those things on the top. So we've got kuta of one at either end, a recess of one in between, a shala of two in the middle, and those little things in the recesses are the panjaras, the kind of panjaras that we find in a recess rather than the primary element. So now we've got the widths, and we go into the heights. One should divide the temple height into 28 parts. So 28. And parts, the term is often the term used for the part is often bhaga, of sometimes amsha, and pada, different terms, and they all mean the same thing. You don't have, they're not like feet and inches, they are simply parts. So you start with an overall number of parts, and then it's divided and apportioned to the different elements. So divide the temple height into 28 parts. The adhisthana is 3 parts. Okay, so we'll start with 3 like that. So happens that the Dipta Agama only tells us one kind of adhisthana. So, okay, we've been given the dimension, the proportions of that somewhere else in the text. So, okay, no choice. We'll draw that. The upper level, now, does that mean the whole temple, or does it mean the whole first tala? You have to work out, you have to try things out, sketching it and see what looks right, and then you have to look ahead. You see we've got the prastaras. So this upper level they're talking about is the pillar level, the wall itself, which can contain a Vedi. I've drawn it with a Vedika included within that portion. That's how I've interpreted it. Then the prastara is 2 parts. Now remember, the prastara is is that set of moldings there, which creates a kind of entablature. The beam, the molding under the kapota itself, and the prati, or the floor. So that's the first tala, but we mustn't forget, and the next bit is 5 parts. Did I get out of order here? Probably, I probably did. The adhisthana is 3 parts. The wall height is 6 parts. The prastara is 3 parts, and the upper level is this thing, the second tala. But we mustn't forget the kutas and shalas of the first tala, which we can now add because we did them at the beginning. The prastara of the second tala is 2 parts. The Vedika is 1 part. And in this case, the Vedika and the Griva are given as separate things rather than combined, rather than the Vedika being subsumed within the Griva. So Vedika is 1 and the Griva is 2. Then we are told the wise man should make the shikara height 4 parts above that. The shikara is the roof, there it is, and the remainder is the stupi. And since we have 28 parts, we know that the remainder is 2, and that is the stupi. And then we're very pleased because it all adds up and it fits together. Sometimes there are problems, and sometimes we have to go back again and try again and work it out, and work out whether we went wrong or whether the text has some inconsistency in it. But always it's the the actual practice of the tradition has to override the text, surely, because if it looks completely wrong, it's not that that all the temples ever built were wrong. It's that there's something either in the interpretation of the text or in the text itself which must be anomalous. Now, we following that passage on the swastika, we're given a variation, and this is very typical, that you move on from one design to another, and you, rather than having to give all the instructions for each time, the text will tell you, now we add this, or we take away that, or you do this, or you do that, and you have to understand that it's taking the previous one for granted, and it's doing some variations on that. So we get a sequence of designs, and I should have said that in this, the typical thing in a South Indian text is that you go from 1 thala up to 12. Even though not many temples above 3 thalas were built, of course we have exceptions like Brihadeshwara, Tanjavur, and so on, but those are rare. But in the theoretical idea is that you go from 1 to 12. And within each of those, within the 1 story, the 2 story, the 3 story, and so on, we have these different choices. So Kailasha is a different elaboration of the 2-story temple. It's divided into 34, still 6 in the plan, and it has an octagonal shikara or dome, and it has a torana in the wall, and it has a projection at the center. We can now go on and compare what a text says with actual practice, and say, yes, we can draw a design from the text, but does that mean that people actually followed it? And the answer is, I think, well, it's all coming from the same tradition. They're not slavishly following texts, and you'll rarely find a temple that exactly follows a particular text, but you will find the same kind of principles applied. And you will find that by going through the texts and the way they think about designs, it will help you to analyze actual designs, because you know what you're looking for. So we know with these, if we're looking, for example, the wonderful Muvara Koil at Kodumbalur, originally 3 temples, 2 survive, one at the center, 2 either side. And we find it divides, I can't read the bottom of the screen because I've got a finger across it, but what does it say? It's however many divisions at the bottom, and you can make it work. You realize that you have to make it work for whole numbers or fractions or simple fractions, half, quarter, 3/4, or so on. But surprisingly, 34, although it's not the universal rule for 2-story vimanas in the text, we do find that 34 divisions of the height is a common enough way of doing it. We find it as well at the temple at Kulambandal, 10th century temple, about 100 years after Kodumbalur. And in this case, the bhaga, the part of the plan, seems to be the same one used for the 34 of the height. Now, that little line, dotted line that you can see that I've drawn on there, that isn't in the text, but I found that this seems to work. And it's why it's important to know the divisions that the texts talk about. Remember that division called the prastara? Well, the second tala starts from the top of the prastara, but we can't actually see that. It's hidden inside the stone, but it's there as a controlling principle, which all goes to show that drawings are an important step between the written text and the actual design. You have to draw what the text is talking about, and then you can make a scale drawing or a full-size drawing, and you can take dimensions off that when you're building the temple. Now, quickly to round off this first part, I'll look at the Maya Mata and its instructions for temples with 4 or more talas or stories. And we'll look at the one for 5 talas. I'm not going to show you the text, but just whiz through the principles. It says, because once it's described in detail, the 1 story, 2 story, 3 story, and so on, it becomes it gives you only very basic rules for the subsequent ones. And I think this highlights one of the essential purposes of these texts, which is not to say you have to do it like this, but to transmit to the apprentice architects and craftsmen the understanding of the language. And once you've understood those earlier ones, when we can then work out all these other details for ourselves when we come to a basic framework like this. So we're told the height is 48, and the story heights and the prastaras are 5.5, 2.5, 5.25, 2.5, 5, 2.25, and so on. So we can draw that, and we're told that the bottom is divided into 9, 10, or 11 parts. But we're not told how many parts to divide the upper stories into. So I'm just going to try and interpret it and see if I can come out with something decent. So I've chosen to draw this at 1 to 1.5. The height is 1.5 times the width, probably because it fits on the paper. But we'll see if it looks good. And I've drawn the prastaras along that line so that they line up. The bottom of each tala happens at those points where the little lines go up. So let's put a single unit on top and divide it into 3 and give it a projection in the middle. And having started off on that track, we can't, the choice for the next one down is not infinite, because it has to fit nicely. The middle projection mustn't be narrower than the one above. So let's try 7. And let's try, how about, yeah, that's good. The shala will be a good proportion. And how about if in the recesses we put some of this type of panjara that doesn't go all the way up, just for a bit of variety. It doesn't go all the way up, but its head stops in the kaputa. And then fiddle around, see what works. Well, 8 seems to work, and we can have full scale panjaras in between the kuta and the shala. Let's do the same pattern here, see if it works. Yes, the shala will be wider, and getting quite wide, the shala there, but I think it still works. Yeah, it still looks quite nice. We can fiddle around, get it, but I think that's okay. But now what about at the bottom? Now we're limited because they told us 9, 10, or 11 parts. 9 looks a little bit too wide, the shala. Could work. 11, well, that's no good, because the shala is virtually the same width as the one above, and we want it to be expanding up, expanding down, or contracting up. So let's try 10. Oh, that looks okay. That's fine. 10 is fine. We could put the whole thing up on a pita, on a sub base that would give it a bit of extra height. Anyway, there we are. That's my 5-story temple. Sorry, the Maya Mata's 5-story temple, as interpreted. And we can compare it with, let's find out, there aren't so many 5-story temples, but the famous royal temple, mid 12th century Chola temple, the Airavateshvara at Darasoram, will fit the bill. It stands on a pita, a sub base, so it gives it an extra height. It has Ashtavarga, Kuta and Shala and Panjara units in the first 2 talas, so it gives it an extra grandeur over the other one on the left. And it has some interesting variations, like some apsidal shalas turned sideways in the recesses at the top, and it has little circular kutas standing on the platform around the main dome, as well as little Nandi bulls. We can look at the proportions and find it seems to work very well if you divide the wall, and notice that the plan division does happen in the wall zone itself, not in the Vedibanda, which is different from Nagara temples, as we shall see in the second half. And it seems to use the same module for the height, but it's not some clear 1.5 or 2, 91 to 50, whatever proportion that is. But I think we can say that's on the basis of finding whole fractions, that seems to be what the conception is. And if we like, we could make our 5-story Vimana a little bit more slender, like the Airavateshvara, by saying instead of 1 to 1.5, let's make it 1 to 2. The height is twice the width. Easy with Photoshop, except it's made my narcissus, my horseshoe arches, a little bit too thin. Well, that's the end of South India, and I think we said we would have a 5-minute break, if that's okay.
Yes. But Adam,
yes,
Nirja, would you like to take the questions for the Dravida also at the end? Wouldn't that get very confusing?
Oh, if you, I thought at the end, but I don't mind. You tell me.
Because if the language is, unless we're using the same language,
okay.
I thought it's better. I think it's better that we do Dravida and Nagara separate.
Okay,
Nirja,
that's fine.
Nirja, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, very much so.
Would you like to do that?
Sure, because Adam had said initially at the end, but sure. I haven't written anything down yet. That's the problem. No questions. But if you have something,
I have plenty. No, I have plenty. I've been making notes. So, Adam, may I shoot off?
Yes, please.
So, to begin with, you said Vastu and Shilpa Shastras. Are they synonymous? Where are the overlaps?
There isn't anything. There isn't any authoritative ancient explanation of what you should call these things. And both terms are there. A Shilpa Shastra, of course, means a craft, a shastra, a treatise on craft or art.
Exactly.
Yeah. And Vastu is specifically architecture. But and I think in modern scholarship, we like to have a neat category, and we like and it's fair enough to say an architectural text is a Vastushastra, a more general text is a Shilpa, one about sculpture. But of course, there's so much mixture in all of them, of mixtures of both, as well as of ritual and theology and and all kinds of other things in there that it's you don't really find pure Shilpa-shastras or Vastushastras or so. And Manasara Shilpa-shastra, isn't it called that? One of the titles of Manas.
My next question was,
often
so what are
referred-
Manasara, Maya Mata, and Deeptagama? What would they be? They'd be Vastu or Shilpa?
Yeah, I think Manasara is often referred to, I think in Acharya's publications, I think it's referred to as Manasara Shilpa-shastra. I've heard that term anyway, but I suppose strictly it's more about architecture, so we should call it a Vastushastra, and Maya Mata as well. Deeptagama is an agama, so it's an agama with some architectural sections in it. So that's something else. I think the earliest architectural texts were in general religious texts like agamas, and in the earlier ones we find much more general instructions about the shape and the height, the overall proportions. It's only when you get to around the 10th and 11th centuries when these specialized architectural and craft texts, or certainly architectural texts, survive, and it's only then that there's enough detail to draw the buildings in detail. Right. It's also, I think there must have been a proliferation of the texts at that time, because it's also the moment when different regional traditions are getting knowledge of other traditions, right, and consciously combining. And you have the Samarangana Sutradhara, which is where the Raja Bhoj is deliberately getting texts from different traditions, north, south, middle, and putting them all in one big voluminous encyclopedic text.
Yeah. And also with the date, Maya Mata is 12th century, or is it earlier?
It's probably 10th or 11th.
10th or 11th.
But they, of course, all these texts got copied and recopied, and sometimes you get later editions in them, and sometimes you get early, very old passages, revered passages, right, inside an 11th century text. So you have to be critical and try to figure out which bits are from different dates. But I really do think, and I hope that by going through this, that I hope you can see that they do fit. A given text is of its time and does fit the architecture of its time, and that's kind of how certainly me as an architect, that's how I work out the likely date of a text, because of the architecture it describes. Other people would look at the philology, the script, and the terminology and other things, no doubt.
And the other thing is that when you say agamas, I mean, are these Shaiva agamas? What agamas are they? There would be for some sect, right?
There were Shaiva agamas that Libby Mills her book is on some early 7th century Shaiva agamas, which include early instructions on temples. But I don't think that Deeptagama. I need to check up on it. I mean, I don't think it is specific. I don't think it's Shaiva, strictly Shaiva, because it has things like, this temple is suitable for any god. A lot of them are quite un unsectarian in that they're talking about architecture which can be for Shiva, Vishnu, can be for they tell you how to do a Jain temple, or they say this could also be for the Jains, or it's particularly good for Jain temples. And
Right.
later on, even later on, you start even to get mosques coming in the 15th century or so. So it's certainly not. One thing is very clear is that a given type of temple, while they may say this is dear to Shiva or to Surya or whatever, it's not that the same temple design can be used for different gods. That's very clear.
And my two more questions. When you said about, I think it was a Kodambalur temple, when you said the temple height, when it should be divided into 28. The first one you said was divided into 28?
Yes, and then the second one 38, and I just happened to find 3 examples where 38.
But if it is 28, if you say it's 28, you divide it by 20. How do you begin with the height in the first place? You say the temple height.
That's an important question. You have to distinguish between the actual height and the proportional height. Now, you often in another place you'll be told this kind of temple can be so many hastas, or so you can have a small version and it's this size. A middling version is this size. Big version is this size. But
the temple, the shikara height, the whole height.
And the shikara height, yeah. But and if it's 1 to 2, that will give you the shikara height.
Yeah.
But it doesn't to draw the design. It doesn't really matter what scale you're drawing at. In other words, you can have exactly that thing, that drawing on the left. It could be a little thing that big, or it could be as big as Dharasura. The same. If you see what I mean, there's the actual dimension but the proportions. The proportions are separate from the actual size.
Yeah, yes. And what is the basic unit the hasta based on?
Hasta is there's the angular, which is that, isn't it? And
yes.
Isn't the hasta 24?
What we understood is like it's the patron.
Like this,
it starts with the
elbow.
In the center, and and comes down to your hand. So it's half. It's like that. That's the hasta.
That's the hasta.
Or it could be just this. It could be just a span. I don't.
Yes.
It could be either.
It could be either. But from
I was just wondering.
But for this purpose, there's no need to get hung up about the actual size, because it's the relative
proportion.
size.
Exactly.
The proportion is what counts.
Correct. I think there are Nisha, you can take over, please. The whole bunch from the chat.
Yeah, there's tons of questions, and just to go over some of them that are related. Yeah, one was just answered. Were angulas used as a question? Living the and sketches, I was wondering how and why the names swastika and Kailasha were assigned to the particular ratios you went to describe. Are there any mentions of the reasons in the texts, in the DA, I guess?
There are no mentions of why particular names are given, but there are certain kinds of names that are popular, names of flowers, names of mountains, Kailash and so on, Meru, Svastika is a popular name. Sarvatubhadra, meaning beautiful on all sides, is a popular name. And the thing to know is that this is a different kind of typological label from, let's say, Nagara, Dravida, or or Vallabhi or Bhumija, whatever. This is the name of a particular design within one of those systems. So you can have a Nagara temple called Svastika, a Dravida temple called Svastika, and between two texts you can have a completely different Dravida temple called Svastika in one text from in another text. You could the Samarangana Sutradhara, which assembles texts from different places, probably has about if you read the whole thing, there are probably about 5 different Kailasa temples in that text, meaning completely different things. So these are popular temple names. They're not. It's no good saying to an architect, you haven't built a Kailasa temple because I've got a book that says that Kailasa temple looks like that. I think the reason to answer the question of why Kailasa is because it's a mountain and it's Shiva's home, and it's a good name. Temples are like mountains. It's a very good name for a temple, and swastika is an auspicious symbol, isn't it? And it's also a popular name for a temple type, but they never tell you why this particular one is given to this particular type.
Ujjwala is asking that she once heard from a scholar that Gungaikonda Cholapuram temple, the height and breadth proportions went wrong during the building process, and the sthapatis had to create a bulge in the shikhara to account for the errors. Is that your reading as well?
I don't know, though I do think there is a sort of subtle change of plan from circular to down to square in the tower, which seems to have been thought out and isn't entirely clear, but it's there if you look for it. I don't know whether that's the result of a mistake. I don't think so. I do think there was a change of plan in the Brihadeshwara Tanjavur, which people don't usually mention, in that it starts going up like this, and then several stories up, the angle changes and it goes like that. Now I think that's because they got to here and they thought, oh my God, if we carry on like that, it will be about 2 miles high, and we haven't got the money, or we haven't got the stone, or we don't know if it'll stand up. So they changed the angle a little bit, and they went on like that. That's what I think. So I think the answer is yes for Tanjavur. Don't know for Gangaikonda Cholapuram.
Antoinette is asking, what do you make of the 5 rathas in Mahabalipuram? It's often claimed that they are examples of temple styles. And do they follow any of these Shastric texts?
They're earlier than that period when, as I was saying, the texts that we have don't give so much detail that you could say they follow or they don't follow, or they partially follow or they don't. Examples of temple styles, I would say temple types. I mean, depends how you define style, but temple types all within that Dravida language of the time, and they're certainly doing, whether or not they were intended to be put in worship or not. I think they probably were. Some people think they were like a pattern book, but I think they were probably going to be real temples. But in any case, there's no doubt about it that they do, in a beautiful way, they do the typical thing of showing variations in shape and composition using a common language, which is what you find all over, but you find it's very beautifully done there. And it's also what the texts are often doing. They're giving you they're giving you different imaginative possibilities within a given system.
I mean, we did talk about the Agamas to some extent. I believe they were used for the placement of images around the temple, Rhoda is asking. Were they also used as architectural text? Did they have philosophical bits in them as well, the agamas?
I think the answer is yes to all those. They had philosophical bits, a lot of ritual bits, and some of them have architectural bits in them.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering whether you think these texts, particularly the later ones, existed first and architects followed them, or if maybe some of the texts were written based on what their authors observed in the already built temples. So
well, that's
chicken and egg.
That's one of the basic questions, isn't it? And that's why we need to. Yeah, you can only answer the question by, I'm hoping to show, by actually doing it. You actually see, getting into the skin of the architects, or trying to design from the text. Because before we can answer the question, we first of all have to know, is it possible? Can you build a temple from a text? That's what we're talking about. Okay, yes, you can. At least you can design it and then go on to build it. Does that mean that people did? Well, by looking at these comparisons, you see they're using the same principles, and we may be able to find a text that is a temple that exactly follows a text. I've never found one yet. In plan, yes, but in plan and elevation, I've never yet found one. But even if we did find one, which came first? And in a way, it's a kind. I think it's the obvious question. It's a big question, but it's a false question, because they come out of the same milieu, the same tradition. They're the same way of thinking. They aren't. And in any case, practice has to come first. They didn't write these texts with no architectural.
In a vacuum.
The language had to be there before they could write the text, because they're imagining something very specific that they didn't just come out of someone's head. They aren't inventing the whole thing and then saying, "Go ahead, these are the rules. Go and build it." So of course the buildings came first, but then after that, it's the two sides of the same coin, part of the same tradition. Some of the same people are designing buildings and writing texts, and they develop together. The texts, some texts will give a framework which people will follow to build buildings, and then the builders, the architects will think of new ideas and start building other things, and then the text will catch up and describe those. But then the text can also think ahead, because the system itself has a potential, has possibilities within it. So the people writing the texts, who aren't just writing, they're designing at the same time. They're saying, "Oh, look, you could also try out this, you could try out that." So these are potential designs, and we'll describe that, and then someone will look at that, and then, we'll try and build that. And there's a new challenge. We've got to draw it and then build it. So it's a back and forth. As soon as the texts and the architectural traditions get going, it's a kind of dialectic relationship between the two. I hope that makes sense.
No, and I think that's a very nice way of looking at it, that they would all come out of the same milieu, and it's that, and they were created together, almost looking at each other. I think there's one more question, and then we'll take a break, Adam. If the texts give any insight into the process of construction in any way.
Also a good question, because and I'm sure it's prompted by the observation that what I've been showing is about drawing and about designs and proportions and composition, but not about going to the quarry and cutting stone and how to transport it and and how to carve it, and all of those, what materials to use, and all of those things, nor what kind of workman. There's a little bit about that, but you know, how not about the economy, not about the organization of the site. There's sometimes some of these aspects are touched on in different parts of the text, but you can't. There's a limit to what, you know, there's an awful lot that they don't tell you about the process of construction. They're more to do with design and to do with drawing. They're conceived in terms of drawing. So they're crucial. You can see how texts and drawings together, and I hope to come on to that in the second half, are at least drawings and which relate to texts are crucial in the construction process for making details and in encapsulating dimensions and so on. But it's that aspect that the texts are mainly concerned with, rather than the practicalities of material and actual making. Welcome to the second half, where I'm going to continue asking the question, can you build a temple from a text? This time looking at Nagara architecture in northern India. And again, the answer is yes. So turn off now if that's enough, and stay here if you would like a full explanation. Now, as we were saying earlier, it's around the 10th and 11th centuries that Vastushastra texts, at least the ones that have come down to us, begin to talk about temple designs in lots of detail, enough detail for us, not always, but very often, if we know the architectural language concerned, to be able to draw the designs of which the texts speak. It's around that time that North Indian Nagara temple architecture is developing, or has already begun to develop, from the simple Latina spire that we see here into a composite kind of Nagara temple, which we can term anek andaka, not with one limb or egg, a multiple composite form. The Latina form that you see here itself has a long history and many complexities, which we're not going to go into, because in the texts we are concerned mainly with the composite type. Though Latina types are, of course, the basis of the more complicated Nagara. So what's happening already in the 8th and certainly through the 9th and definitely in the 10th century is that the single Latina is becoming composite, and we already have a development of the temple wall, which is increasingly stepping out and which increasingly has recesses between the different projections. So in the case of a 5 projection temple wall, we have these different elements. And once again, I would remind you that the terms are very fluid and very varied, and the same term will be used in different ways in different texts, and a given text will use different terms for the same element. But let's give them names, and let's give them some names that modern scholarship is used to, but bear in mind that you won't always find the same names in texts. So we find that the corner is very often called the karna. The central projection is usually called the Bhadra. And in a 5 projection wall, we have 2 karnas, Bhadra in the middle, and 2 intermediate elements, which are often called a pratirata. Now, there are different terms for the things we put on top. Now, in these composite temples, Anekandaka temples, the most characteristic thing to put on top of a projection is a little shikara, a small latina shikara. In the texts, that can be called a kuta, it can be called a rata, a ratika. In the text we'll be looking at today, the Aparajita Pracha, a 12th century text from Western India. The term that is usually employed for these elements is a shringa. So they'll say on top of in this case, it would say on top of the karna, there is a shringa, which is a little latina shikara, like that. And not always explicit, but sometimes often explicit through the pillar moldings that are there at the top of the wall. This projection plus the little shikara on top need to be read as a single unit, which is a kuta stamba, a pillar with a kuta or a shringa or a little shikara on the top. So just as in South Indian architecture, we mustn't separate the kutas and shalas on top from the wall below. So in Nagara architecture, we need to read the thing as a whole and not make it all into bits so that we lose the sense of the whole composition. Sometimes instead of a shringa or a little shikara, in Western India especially, we have something which in the Aparajita Pracha is usually referred to as a tilaka, which is a small little pavilion like that, which is the basis of those complicated samvarana roofs that we see on Western Indian mandapas. And look, if you look on the left, you'll see that I've drawn some red lines. And this is quite important when looking at the texts, to know that the plan, when they start with the plan, they are talking about the plan at the lowest level of the molded base, which in northern terminology is called the Vedibanda. And the lowest level of that is, the lowest element is a kumbha with a hoof, a little toe at the bottom, which is called a kura or a hoof. And the plan, when the text gives you the plan, it is normally talking about the plan at that level. Now it will tell you about different steps out, in and out, different projections. You mustn't think that because it doesn't mention the recesses, that there are no recesses. Because if you look at that drawing on the left, you'll see that the kura sticks out, and then it steps in to the kumbha and the other moldings of the Vedibanda. And then it sticks in again for the wall, the jangha, the thigh. And then it steps out again to the second level for the moldings of the varandika, the cornice, and the little shikara on the top. And although those 2 inner levels are stepped in from the kura, so as you're moving up within each element, you can see that the recesses appear by necessity. Okay, so the plan may not have, the plan as given in the text may not have any recesses, but by the time you get up to the wall, it will have recesses because as you go up, the courses of masonry, the moldings step in. So, but if you have two elements side by side, they're stepping in. By the time you get to there, there's a recess in between. So, as well as a tilikas, you also have a different kind of element in the middle. Very often it's like this. Some texts call it simhakarna, whatever they call it. Its origin goes back to the Vallabhi type of temple, which ultimately derives from the barrel-roofed Chaitya hall type of building with its hole in its half, which become gavakshas, and they get woven into these patterns, and that's what that thing in the middle represents. An edicule made representing a Vallabhi type of temple. As I say, we'll focus on the Aparajita Pracha, 12th century Western India, and on chapter 159, which is about the 21 temples, 21 or 25? 25 temples, starting with Keshari and ending with Meru. The Keshari temple is an early form of Anek Andaka temple. Probably the temple, going back to that question about which came first, I'm sure that they were starting to build these temples in the 9th century before they were written about in a text. But it turns out that this form became established as the first of a series which appears in a number of texts. And it's an interesting series because you can see how the texts and the practice evolve side by side. And so you find it in these 25 temples in the Samarangana Sutradhara in the 11th century. And you can see that's thinking in kind of 10th or 11th century terms in the way they talk about the design. By the time you get to the Aparajita Pracha, it's moved on, the text has moved on, as has the practice, and you get a lot of more complicated temple types that have been worked out by then. But to go back to this, the most basic, the Keshari, it's a single shikara on the top, like a Latina temple, one of those Vallabhi things in the middle, and kutastambas, little shikaras on pillars at the corner. You could, drawn from the text, you'll see an ambulatory around the sanctum, because in these series of temples in the text, they're talked about as Sandhara temples with an inner ambulatory, inner pradakshina pata. But in reality, they don't all have such things. It's an option. And the way the ambulatory is drawn in the plan is not necessarily what you would, the proportions of all that are not necessarily what you would find in practice, which doesn't matter. What's interesting here is it's the outside form and composition. Now, the Keshari is known as Panch Andaka. It's got 5 andas. And the andas, the eggs, are the amalakas and the finial on top, that ribbed crowning member capped by a pot finial. So when it says 5 andakas, it's the one on the top and the 4 little ones at the corner. Now those tilakas that I showed you, they don't count as andakas, which is part of the rules of the game. The game of this 25 temples is to get from 5 andakas to 101. So the Meru temple has 101 andakas. So each successive type has to have 4 more andakas. Second in the series is called Sarvatobhadra. And Sarvatobhadra is one of those popular temple names, and you'll find it in other texts meaning something different from this. But it's a recurrent name for number 2 in this series of 25 temples. And it's a simple development from the Keshari. The Keshari, in a very archetypal way of developing in Indian temple architecture, a simpler form becomes the top of a more complicated one. So the Keshari becomes the top of the Sarvatobhadra. The Vallabhi thing in the middle goes and the corner kutas, you get 1, 2, 1, 2 going down at the corners. And the example I've shown you there is a Sandhara temple, does have an ambulatory, and that's why you get those grills, those jali screens in the Bhadra, bringing light into the Pradakshina Pata. So the Sarvatobhadra temple is Navandaka. It has 9 andakas. Those actually appear before this kind of quintessential Shekari temple. Now, the term Shekari, you won't, Daki popularized it, the term, for the multi-spired type of temple. He didn't say, and I don't know if, I never asked him when I had the chance, which text did he get the term from, and he never wrote it down. But so it's and it's not, it's a bit of a, we're kind of free to choose our own definition of Shekari. The term relates to shikaras, but when does a thing stop being simply Anekandaka and also become Shekari? Well, let's say my definition, for what it's worth, is call it Shekari when you have when the middle element is a small shikara, a small Latina shikara. So you have a small version of the whole temple appearing on the chest of the central element. So this would be the most simple Shekari, which is Navandaka, 9 andakas, 9 little 9 amalakas crowning small shikaras. You get a sense that the small ones are projecting out, expanding out from the center. And as things develop through the 10th and 11th centuries, the walls progressively step out. I'm just telling you all some basic things you need to know before we come to the text, so you can understand when we get to the text. You'll immediately be able to see what it's talking about. So the walls progressively step out more and more to a stage where the corners and the intermediate element, the pratiratas, come into line, so that you get a kind of stepped diamond plan. You can draw a straight line across the corners. And having done that, we get the opportunity of putting in that little angle. I don't know if you can see on the photo on the right, between the corner and the things either side, there is just another tiny little kuta stamba with a little shikara poking out in that angle on the first bhumi, first tier, first story. And you can see it happens again on the second story. This is one of the cases where practice is more subtle and complicated than the theory that you find in the text, because in the text they never talk about those little things hidden in the recesses. They do talk about them when they stick out. When they're sticking out, we'll see it in a minute. And they give them a name, which is a Nandi or a Nandika. But these are kind of hidden, almost hidden away Nandikas, just embedded in the body of the temple and just poking through within the recess. So if you look at this shikara, you can see they perform a very interesting function as you start to get more complex, because at a certain stage, you, as well as these half shikaras, sometimes called ura shringas, the half ones that you see emerging along the cardinal axes, you also get quarter ones in the angles, so that the four emerging from one happens at a smaller scale as you go out and down. Having started this process, then the architects, as the tradition develops, draw out the different possibilities of the architectural system and create more and more complex designs within the basic rules, in such a way that as things develop, the earlier temple forms become subsumed within more complicated temple forms, which, as you can see, proliferate, expand, and emanate downwards and outwards. So that in a complicated temple, the sense of dynamism you get, the sense of all these small microcosmic elements manifesting forth and emerging and expanding and emanating out from the center, that same pattern of movement that you see almost happening before your eyes in one of those complicated temples actually contains the stages of development through the tradition within the single design, because the earlier ones are there, progressively becoming the top of something more complicated. Now, that same way of thinking of emanatory sequences of increasingly complicated designs, of drawing one design forth from another, is there in this chapter 159 of the Aparajita Pracha, and indeed of all these different texts which have the 25 temples starting with Keshari. And in the I've written about this. Still, things take so long to come out, but one day some articles will come out which explain all this stuff. I've looked at I've looked at these texts, and you see that in the Aparajita Pracha, it's not doing exactly the same as architectural history does, but it's absolutely thinking in the same way. How can we go from this design to another more complicated one? And several of those types in that emanatory sequence that we see in Western India through the 11th and 12th centuries are actually there described very well in the Aparajita Pracha. And as I say, each time we have to add 4 more andakas. And in this drawing, I'm just showing you the basic change of plan. I'm not showing you all 25, but I'm showing you each time from Keshari to Sarvatobhadra onwards. Each time the plan changes, and then the overall shape changes, and then within that envelope, they fiddle around with. We need to go from 53 to 57 andakas. So we take away some shringas and we put take away some tilakas and we'll put shringas instead, and we'll add another ura shringa and we'll get to the required number. Now you know everything you need to know to understand my worked example, which is a temple type called it's called Indra Nila. Indra Nila. I think in the Samarangala, the equivalent one is called Indra Lila. And in the Aparajita Pracha, it's the Indra Nila. But the names are more or less the same. The designs change from text to text because, as I say, they keep up with the times. So, as ever, let's start with a bindu and give it some axes. The text says, in a width of 16 amshas. Now, as we saw, I said earlier, amshas, bhagas, padas, and various other terms, they all mean, they're not units of measurements, they mean a part. So in a width of 16 amshas, we know from working on these things that we're talking about a square plan, and it's got 16 parts. So we draw a square of 16 parts. It happens to be a grid. But it's actually less concerned with grids. It is a grid, but sometimes they subdivide, redivide. The real interest is that width and the number of parts. So in a width of 16 amshas, let's increase the size so you can see better. The karna is 2 bhagas wide. Bhagas, same as amshas. So the karna is the corner, and we'll make it 2. Easy. Then there is a nandika. That's why I told you about those funny little things hidden in the recesses. But here, the texts don't talk about them when they're hidden, but they do talk about them when they stick out. So here is a sticking out nandika, which is 1 bhaga. And a pratirata of 2 amshas, 2 parts. Once again, there should be a nandi of 1 bhaga. So we're moving from the corner towards the center, so it must be the next little bit. So 1 bhaga is a nandi or a nandika. And a bhadra of 4 amshas. See, they like to change between bhagas and amshas just for a bit of variety, not always to use the same word. Oh, well, that's lucky. We've got it right, because you can see 4 gives us the bhadra. Everything has matching projection. Now this, I cheated, you see, I looked ahead. You have to look ahead. I knew this already because I read it ahead. I could have drawn the pratirata with less of a projection, but I drew it the same width and the same depth to make one of those stepped diamond plans that I showed you. So matching projection, sometimes called, it was probably, I haven't put the Sanskrit there, it was probably samdala. So all the dalas, all the petals are the same. Or it may have said the nirgama, the projection is all the same, something like that. But we know it must be talking about, especially as we're at a certain point in the sequence, and we know that already they've started to use the stepped diamond plan. So okay, so the karna and the pratirata are in line, and the karna and all the projections have the same width as they have a depth. The projection in the bhadra, the projection is 1 bhaga. So I cheated, I looked ahead, I already got it 1. Now we've got a little segment of the plan, but now we know everything we need to know for the outside form of the plan. So we can double it up and there's your plan. There's a half plan of this temple. The garbha is 64 bhagas. Now, we've got 16 from corner to corner. How can we get 64? If it had said 8 or 10, that would be okay. We could make The Garbha is the Garbhagriha, the sanctum. How can it be 64? Oh, yeah, 8 8 to 64. Must be 8 like that. They must be 64 squares. Okay, so that's good. Enclosed by 1 bhaga of walls. Now remember, it told us these are Sandhara temples with an Andharika or ambulatory. So that's a wall of 1 bhaga is going around here. The outer wall should be 1 bhaga, while the Brahmantika should be 2. So the Brahmantika, this is an example of where we have to know from the context, because we know, Pradakshinapata, Andhara, Andharika, those all mean an ambulatory. But a Brahmantika, what's a Brahmantika? I mean, I don't know what a Brahmantika is, but I know it must be talking about the ambulatory, the Andharika, because of the context. We're looking at the plan, and this is where, so it must be like this. Okay. Look, the outer wall looks a little bit thin on the corner, but okay. I think if we were building it, we might bend the rules a bit, and probably the central sanctum in an ambulatory might well have some projections like that, which we could probably add. Be that as it may, a crucial thing to remember is that the plan which we've just been given is at the level of the kora, at the hoof level. So there will be recesses between the different elements. So it'll step back twice from the hoof, from the kora, once to the Vedibanda, and then again in again to the wall, to the main janga or wall section. So once we get up to the wall, we'll have recesses like I've shown here in grey. So now we've done the talamana, the plan measurement. Now we're going to do the urdhvamana, or the upper measurement. So here's the plan. Now I need to admit that the Aparajita Pritya in this chapter doesn't tell you it tells you the composition. It doesn't give you the vertical heights. I haven't found any other section in another chapter where it told you these things for this kind of temple. Fine, we'll just do it by eye. Maybe the architect is free to do it, or maybe that bit's been lost. So I've drawn the heights by eye, but more crucial than the heights is what are the elements that go in the different parts of the plan into the shikara. Now, architects among you will know that plans and elevations are conventions showing you a flat thing that in reality is in 3 dimensions. So we must, in thinking about what they're discussing, we have to be thinking not just in elevation, but in 3 dimensions. So I'm going to show you the plan of the shikara at the same time as I work out the elevation. One should build 2 shringas in the karna, while the shikara, can I move? I need to read the bottom. That moves up. Great. I can even move all you lovely people up a bit, and I can see the bottom. Okay, one should build 2 shringas in the karna. Shringa, you'll remember, is a word used in this text to mean the kutas, the little shikaras, on top of the different projections. So 2 shringas in the karna. Does that mean that there are 2 karnas and so each one has a shikara? Or probably given the type of temple. Why doesn't it move on? There we are. two shringas in the karna, like that, which give us this in elevation, stepping up. We need to know that the corners of the upper little shikara sit, the controlling square, never mind the ins and outs, but the sort of underlying square has its corner on the center of the one below. While the shikara has a width like the sun's. I should mention that it was Mattia Salvini who I worked with on the translation from the Sanskrit in this case. So the shikara has a width like the sun's, which Mattia knew is that he knows that there are 12 suns, or maybe 12 stars or something. So a width like the sun means 12. So the shikara has 12, so it must be talking about that top shikara, the one, not the whole superstructure, but the one in the middle, because if we count the squares, we'll find a width of 12 goes very nicely between the middle of the two shringas which support the main shikara. There we are. In the Nandika, there is a tilaka. In the Nandika, there is a tilaka. In each Nandika, it must mean. Does it mean all of them? Or no, it means the one, I think it means the one next to where we've got to. So we give it a tilaka, and that doesn't count as an andaka when we come to count, because we know that the Indra Lila has to have 53 andakas. And when we get to the end, if we've got 53, we know we've got it right. So that's a tilaka in there. The pratyanga is 2 bhagas. So what's a pratyanga? Oh, those are the tilakas in the Nandika. What's a pratyanga? Well, it's going to be one of those little quarter shikaras, nestling in the corner between the main shikara and the first Ura Shringa. How do I know that? Not because I know what a pratyanga means. This is my point about terminology. It's not that I know that I have to put one of those quarter shikaras here, because I look in the dictionary and it tells me a pratyanga is that. That might be helpful, but I might not find it, or I might find a different meaning for pratyanga. But what I do know, because I've worked out it's this kind of temple they're talking about, is that the next thing they've got to tell us is that, and what fits there, it's one of those. So it's from the architecture that I know that pratyanga means this, not that I know what the architecture is, because I know the meaning of pratyanga. And there are your pratyangas in the elevation. There are 2 shringas in the pratirata. So that's the next pratirata, okay. And now I'm adding them, going backwards from the corner as well, because it's 3-dimensional. It's happening on all 4 sides, conceptually. Of course, real temples have a doorway, and they may have a shukanasa and a mandapa. So 3 sides are the same. One side is going to be a little bit different, but a prasada or a vimana, a temple in these this kind of text is always conceived in an idealized way as a symmetrical 4-sided figure. So that's that when we count the andakas, that's what we're talking about, a 4-sided symmetrical 3-dimensional object. So 2 shringas in the pratirata and an ura shringa of 6 amshas. Those were my 2 shringas in the pratirata. Sorry, ura shringa is, and we know it's right because look, 6. We got 6 spaces left, and we're so good. We've got ura shringa of 6 amshas, and there it is. So we've got 1 ura shringa. There are two Shringas in the Nandika. What does that mean? We had one Shringa in the other Nandika, one Tilaka in the other. If we put two Shringas like we have on the Pratirata in the Nandika, they're going to end up touching each other in the middle, and there's not going to be room for the next Ura Shringa. Oh my God, what does it mean? Two Shringas in the Nandika. Oh, it must mean like this. How about this? Look. And since I know some temples a bit like this, and I know they do that kind of thing, it must be okay. Let's see if it works. So like that, little half shikaras, which are going to be embedded in the side of whatever comes in between. And an Ura Shringa of 4 amshakas, which is there. And it fits because we have 4 squares left. Here it is. A Bhadra Shringa of 2 bhagas. Now the Bhadra Shringa must be the Shringa on the Bhadra. Okay, so that gives us 3 Ura Shringas going down. And we know there actually needs to be something around that. You can't just stop there because there's a space, and we know from actual temples that there's going to be some sort of arrangement in front of that Bhadra Shringa. So I think we've done it. Indra Lila. This was the Indra Lila temple. We count the andakas, and it's got 53 andakas, and we got it right. Now we can compare with practice, and using one of Kailash's scans of the Mahanaleshvara temple at Asuda, we can compare an accurate elevation with the drawing that I've done. And you'll immediately see it's very, very similar. It's what I call a type 3 in the sequence of basic underlying 3-dimensional shapes. But if you look very hard, you'll see the difference is the actual temple, the actual example, which is quite a common, beautiful, compact, often repeated type, doesn't have the little nandikas sticking out, but if you look at the roof, the drawing from the roof, it has the little nandikas hidden in the recesses. So you can test that by that drawing I did years ago by looking at temples and photos and drawing from those. It actually fits on the actual roof plan. So the text is close, but the practice found something different and follows that. Now, so to end with, I'm going to talk about a drawing. As we have seen, drawing and texts are absolutely interconnected. The texts, the way these texts are presented, assumes that you're going to draw. They say, trace this, draw that, construct that, and they only make sense if you draw as you go through the instructions. Now, it so happens that last time I was in Rajasthan, which was 4 years ago, we were at Nagara, 10th century temple complex known as the Sas Bahu, the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law temples. Very beautiful complex. In fact, that basic Shekari temple type that I showed you earlier is one of the subsidiary shrines surrounding the Sas temple, the mother-in-law temple. You know, there are quite a lot of sites where we have the architectural drawings on the ground. Bhojpur, that I've worked on a lot, is the famous one, because there the drawings are inscribed on the rock. And so they've survived. They're very worn out, but they have survived on the rock. But there are many more temple sites where you find some drawings, fragments of drawings on the paving, where it's the original paving around the temple. You'll see that the paving was like the drawing board and the point of reference for the architectural drawings that the builders would have used when designing and when constructing the temples. Now, when we were there 4 years ago, suddenly one of my friends came across a drawing which nobody knew about before. I think the ASI have been replacing one or two of the slabs, and people have been walking over and picnicking on the drawing for 1,000 years, since when they built the temple, and it's still there. And so I said, "Oh, I'll go back next day." And it was I only had one day to do it, and it was raining, and what we chalked on the day before got washed off. So I chalked onto the drawing, chalked over it so you could see better. Then I did a horrible sketch because time was short, and as you can see, it was raining. And I put some measurements on it, and I also took photos of a tape measure so that I could check certain measurements. Now that drawing, I'm very excited to show. I've been looking forward to showing you because it's a world premiere of this drawing and never been seen before. It's been sitting in my sketchbook for 4 years, and I thought I'll do this drawing, work it out for this lecture. And the cat has been sitting on the drawing, but nevertheless, I managed to, from the drawing, scrappy as it is, and the photographs, I could redraw the drawing to scale, and then trace over it the bits you can actually see, because as you can see, a lot of bits are missing. And the whole thing looks like this. The scale is on the right, so you can see it's about 3.5 meters tall. It's actually full, like a lot of the ones at Bhojpur. It is a full-size working drawing, and you could use it to take the dimensions off as you construct the temple, and you could use it to make the blocks of the little shikaras to get the curvature correct. So I can complete that drawing because it's rather like doing a drawing from a text. I mean, completing the drawing, it's the same thing. If you have an idea, once you've worked out what kind of shikara it's talking about, you know how to fill in the missing bits. So there we have a temple design that was kind of hidden there in the drawing. We can double it up and we get the entire shikara. So the obvious question is it the Sas or the Bahu? And well, it's a little bit smaller than either of them. And if you look closely, the composition is not exactly the same. It's similar, but the elements next to the Vadra are different. It's got these little partly submerged shikaras there. It's actually got one more Urashringa at the center. So it's in the same vein, but it's different. You'll notice the temples themselves have stone walls and then a brick superstructure again. So maybe it's I don't know, maybe it's the sister-in-law, or maybe they changed their minds and they, as they went along and didn't follow the drawing exactly. If anybody knows the site very well, perhaps you might have seen the base of a temple that it may have been. So do let me know. It's both the existing temple and the drawing are similar to a type which I call poetically type 3, where you have a stepped diamond plan and those little nandikas, hidden nandikas in between, which you do actually get on the Bahu temple, but they are not. They're very similar to this type 3, but they don't have the stepped diamond plan. They don't have the samdala, the corners. Although they look all the same, the corners and the karanas and the pratiratas, the pratiratas are actually slightly narrower than the karanas. But they do have the nandis, which, if you can see on the top left, probably rather small, but they have little elephants sticking out rather than little shikaras. And the type 3 is one of those types which in the Aparajita Pracha is described very clearly, corresponding very closely to the actual built examples. So I wrote down, why in a talk about text did I end with a drawing? I just scribbled some notes to remind me of why I did that. Oh yes, well, because texts and drawings, they reflect the same way of thinking. And as I've said, the texts expect you to draw as they give the instructions. And probably this is how they transmitted an understanding of the architectural tradition to the people who were becoming architects and craftsmen. Because if you had it would be your job in drawing from the text would be a lot easier if you had a guru looking over your shoulder and you're reciting the text and internalizing it and you're drawing at the same time. The guru would no doubt help the interpretation of the text. But even without the guru, I hope I have shown that you can get to the drawing that it expects you to draw. And the drawing, of course, is one step closer to the built reality, to the actual building. It's an intermediate stage between the text, if you are using a text, and the actual building. But, and this is the big but, you still have to know the tradition. You still have to go beyond the text, indeed beyond the drawing, and fill in the details. We've got to, what it's given you is a skeleton, but we've got all the gavaksha patterns, all the pillar moldings, so many things it may have left out that you'll have to fill in. And the text is, as well as inviting you to draw, is inviting you to complete the thing. It's inviting you to interpret, to improvise, and to be creative in realizing the design of which it has given you the skeleton. And that's true of, in that way, I think a drawing like that is very close to the kind of thing that the texts are giving you. And I thought I'd point out that there are different kinds of drawing, just as there are different kinds of text. I mean, the texts, they're all, the ones that are about temple designs, they're all aiming at the same thing, giving a framework for the design of temples, but some give you more detail and some give you less. So some give you only the very bare framework, and others give you more than that. But no matter how much detail they give you, you've still got to know it, know the language, fill in all the details, and invent new things, other things that the text didn't tell you. So just to illustrate how drawings are like texts, drawings are of different kinds and give you different amounts of detail. The one over on the left is a drawing of a Bhumija temple at Bhojpur, which beautifully gives you the very essential framework with the proportions between the different parts of the plan and the elevation. But you'll notice that the little shikaras are very charming, but they're not realistic. They're sort of a bit lopsided, and they're not. You if you built that, it would look very funny. Whereas in the one at Nagara, although I do question the sort of curvature of the top shikara, but otherwise you could actually, and I've measured it, the bottom ones have the radius is 3 times the base and all that kind of thing. So you could actually use those ones as a template to set out the height and the curvature of the shikaras. But it's not like, for example, this drawing from Bhojpur, which is a full-scale working drawing for moldings, for the pita, the sub base, and what remains is it would no doubt have continued, but what survives is the kumbha and the kura of a Bhumija temple. And you'll see it has elevational detail in it as well as sectional detail. But you can't, while it gives you all the dimensions and the profiles in it, which you could use to make a template to make the stones and to start to build the temple, you still have to know how to interpret. You still have to know the language and to know which bit is elevation for the decoration on the surface, which bit is section, and so on. But you can see it's a much more specifically detailed drawing than either of the ones to the left. Or this one, also at Bhojpur, is a conceptual drawing. It's an idea for an open pillared mandapa with a sort of a kind of samvarana roof with little Central Indian versions of Dravida kutas on the roof. But the profiles are all a little bit wonky, and it has a kind of freedom to the line that shows that it's more a kind of a sketching out an idea type of drawing. So in text and in drawings, there are different degrees of detail. We have to know the architecture, we have to complete it, we have to improvise and invent. And another thing is that in both that drawing and the texts both exemplify is that there are these potential designs kind of hidden there, and the architect then has to realize them through that next stage of thinking and design, and then of course through the actual stage of building and getting the material and getting paid for it, and then doing what the client wants, and telling the client he won't go to heaven or get rich if he doesn't do it just like this, and he might have his idea, or she might have all those things that are involved with actually making the thing as it actually is. These are just I'm nearly finished, to say, well, texts themselves are inventive and creative and contain designs that have never been built, great flights of imagination like this Navatmaka temple from the Samarangana Sutradhara, which is very complex. And if you decided, yes, we will build that, you would have to do an awful lot of further work, and you would create something that probably as an individual architect you would never have thought of. And in that way, it's rather like some of the miniature temples of a similar period in Karnataka, where very inventive, never built ideas for temples are created by the craftsmen in the miniature temples that are carved over the niches of the temple wall. And in those miniature temples, just as in a text, you haven't got a client and you haven't got to think, how do I actually build it? So maybe you can be freer and more inventive than you often can when things have to be more realistic. And finally, when we're talking about hidden designs, which you have to find and discover, they're also there, as I think you will have sensed, within the architectural tradition itself, through the way of thinking which draws out one design from another, through a complicated architectural system that has certain potential, certain inherent ideas that are there once the system has been set up, but which have to be drawn out and explored, and which you can find, which in a way, it sounds absurd, but those designs exist in the medium, in the tradition, before anybody has built them, or before anybody has even thought about them and written about them in a text and drawn them. Pulling out one design from another. And I hope one of the lessons that I hope to have put across is that understanding architectural text is not it can't be done just through words. That as architects know, the best way to understand something is to draw it. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. That was magisterial. It was magisterial. I mean, there's nothing short of that. It's what a cosmic effort.
Well, I hope it wasn't too much. I thought I'll try and make it very
no,
clear.
You have simplified it as much as anybody could. And I don't see how something as complex as this could have been simplified. You've tried to put in every single component. You've broken it down to the essential alphabets, really, and tried to then say how these alphabets create different languages. But of course, there are hundreds of varieties within the subcontinent, and it is interesting to know that, you looked at Aparajita Pricha, and you're looking at Samarangana Sutradhar. There must have been texts. What about texts which were non-Sanskrit? Were the texts written in vernacular?
There are, and this is one of the, I suppose one of the questions is if these are as I was trying to argue, if these are not purely theoretical and divorced from practice, how come they were in Sanskrit, not in the vernacular? Exactly. And I think, and there are some vernacular ones certainly from Western India, and there are texts in Tamil as well as Sanskrit texts from South India, which are definitely close to practice and more for the people actually building to use. And I think the Sanskrit texts are an indication of the elite status that architecture had in the medieval period, and how Vastushastra architecture was brought into the kind of into the status of one of the branches of knowledge that it was important to know, and it was important for kings to have books about, and so on. Even if they didn't, read it as their bedtime reading, it was considered important, and stapatis would become important people. Not the poor devils who did the hard work, but the stapati became somebody with status, and interacted with the priest and with the patron, whether the patron was and in some cases the patron was the king. And the texts perhaps assume more than the text perhaps give the impression that of patrons being particularly elite. Well, of course, on the whole, they were, but I do wonder whether the translation into Sanskrit and the writing down wasn't part of this the sort of process of making architecture and something that an elite branch of knowledge, but that if the stapatis were also becoming important at the same time, they would be speaking Sanskrit and keen to show that they did. Certainly, the Sanskrit texts weren't written by somebody who didn't know the architecture. The ritual parts and other parts could well have been, but it's very clear. I hope it became clear in the talk that the texts are about thinking about actual buildings, and some stapatis would surely have been building and writing. It wasn't, and the people who wrote those things were drawing. They were showing people how to draw, and it was totally a dialectical thing with building practice. But whether the less elite temple traditions all had texts. I'm certainly not saying that you have to have a text in order to build a temple. You have to have, or as we can tell from these buildings, they are very formal, structured. They're a very formal and structured art form, with huge room for invention within those very formal structural rules. And that's part of the joy of them, is that all the things you can do within those rules. So the structured system was there, whether or not you had a text. And so it could be that the most poetic and Sanskrit texts are just the very elite remnants of something that was more, which had different degrees of sophisticated high culture, but it's still a reflection of it. My main point is that they are a reflection of something which is to do with the nitty-gritty of practice, even if a little bit separate from actual building and more to do with conceptual design, which then has to be translated into actual building.